You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. Chris Voss here from thechrisvossshow.com, thechrisvossshow.com. Welcome to the big show, my family and friends. Welcome to all that good stuff. I think we screwed up the audience soundboard. Wow. We started playing rock. People are going to be like, are you a DJ? What's going on over there, Chris? Well, we finally got it right. Welcome to the show, my family and friends. We got an amazing gentleman and author on the show. He assures me that he is of both, so we're going to check his references as well. But in the meantime, we're talking to our audience and asking them to refer the show to your family, friends, and relatives. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, youtube.com/Chris Voss, linkedin.com/Chris Voss. Subscribe to the big LinkedIn newsletter. And also, we're over on TikTok. Give us some help over there. We're trying to be cool with the kids, and they're not sure if they're going to let us get on their lawn or not. Wait. Is it the opposite of that? I don't know how that works. Today we have an amazing gentleman on the show, and he has a book that is one of these books that I'm like, I wish somebody would write a book on this, because I really would like to know more about what the hell is going on and why it's so expensive to buy a house here and other things. He's the author of the newest book that just came out May 2nd, 2023, that's titled Plunder, Private Equity's Plan to Pillage America. Brendan Ballou is on the show with us today, and he's going to be talking to us about his amazing work and very thick book with a massive amount of notes. Brendan is a federal prosecutor, and he served as a special counsel for private equity at the U.S. Department of Justice. You may have heard of it. It's a kind of a larger organization there. He began his legal career in the department's National Security Division, where he advised the White House on counterterrorism policy. He graduated from Columbia University and Stanford Law School. Welcome to the show, Brendan. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming. I've been really interested in this discussion and all that good stuff. Give us a .com wherever you want people to find you on the interweb, which is in the sky.
Probably plunderthebook.com or Twitter/Brendan Ballou.
There you go. So, Brendan, what motivated you want to write this book?
So I really did not know what private equity was until I was many months into this project. And so I don't think any of your viewers or listeners should feel embarrassed about it, because I certainly didn't know. But I was working at the Justice Department in the antitrust division, and when one company wants to buy another, they have to submit forms to DOJ and to the FTC. And I was looking at these forms, and all these companies were getting bought by firms that I had never heard of, Carlyle, KKR, Blackstone. It just seemed like the entire economy was getting bought up by these businesses that seemed like mysteries. So I started researching what they were, learned about this idea about private equity, and realized that nobody had really written much for a popular audience about it. And so I tried to find out more.
There you go. Here, I always thought private equity was something that my dad had, and he wouldn't give it to me when I asked him to loan me some money. Can I give $5, Dad? He's like, no, it's private equity. So what is private equity? What are these private equity firms? Give us a baseline foundation that we can define on.
It's a great question to ask. So private equity firms take a little bit of their own money, some investor money, and a whole lot of borrowed money to buy up companies. They then try to make financial or operational changes to those companies with the aim of selling it, for a profit a few years later. So it's a very simple idea, but because of the legal structures that we've got around private equity firms, they have incentives that ultimately can lead to really bad effects, often for the companies that they buy.
And I've been wondering about this for a long time. Like I mentioned in the show, this is one of these books that I've been waiting for someone to write. So thank you very much for covering this. And I think this is a really good expose where the American public needs to understand what's going on. I was just watching before the show the network scene of what was it? The Network, the movie. Get up out of your chairs. Can you just leave me alone with my radial tires and my TV shows, and just let me go through my day. But people need to realize this impacts them. And I grew up in the era where I came into business and life in 1986, graduating high school, of the greed is good. The Ivan Biosky, the Michael Millikins, leverage buyouts. And this whole thing where I guess America, or at least investors on Wall Street, said, yeah, screw Main Street. Let's just do whatever we want. So I watched the whole rise of that. And some of this, I suppose, comes from that. What is your background? Tell us a little bit more about you, and what got you interested? What got you working for the Department of Justice and in this field?
Yeah, well, I don't have an entrepreneurial bone in my body, so I was never going to, form a company and become a billionaire or something like that. But
there's still time.
I ultimately got interested in sort of these broader issues around antitrust and economic justice, really because of my family. My mom, before she had me, was a community organizer in the Midwest and worked to make sure that people who couldn't pay their bills to the utilities wouldn't have their heat shut off in the winter. And so I think I learned from her and from other, from my dad and from others, the importance of making sure that, you have an economy and a set of laws that actually work for ordinary people. So that's what drove me to those issues. And then, I sort of explained on the specifics of why this topic specifically. But I'll say, I think, like you said, people, you kind of came of age where greed is good. I don't think that, that private equity is really different from anywhere else, and that, unless we change human nature, people are always going to be greedy. That's not, that's not necessarily a bad thing. The challenge that we've got is that we've got a legal structure in place that allows private equity firms to make an enormous amount of profit, oftentimes at the expense of the very companies they buy, and, not just the companies, but the people that work there and even the customers that they're trying to serve.
Yeah, I think a famous depiction of the Ivan Biosky leverage buyout age, Millikan age, was in the movie Wall Street. Everyone's familiar with that. In fact, everyone's always like, "No, Ivan Biosky didn't say that, Chris. It was, Michael Douglas." And I'm like,
yeah.
You didn't understand what the movie's based on. But, there's the example where he takes over the airline of whatchamacallit, the big cokehead, and he and then he fires the employees and all that sort of stuff. Corporate rating was the big thing back then, and I've always wondered, with private equity, they'll go buy. I think Sears is a good example where they'll buy it out and then they'll just scrape it and just destroy it, and then the bankruptcy, and somehow it's like this zombie that stays alive.
Yeah.
My question has always been, how are these people making money? And you detail that in the book and all these different ways they can make that happen.
Yeah, maybe I can talk through a couple specific examples. So, when you're talking about retailers, one of the ones that I think about is Shopko, which was, if you grew up in the Midwest, was kind of like one step above Walmart, but one step below Target. It was a great store. It was bought by a private equity firm, and then they did a lot of the tactics that are really, might be obscure to most people, but are very common within the private equity world. So they did something called a sale leaseback, where they required Shopko to sell all of the assets, the stores that it owned, and lease them back to themselves, which creates a quick hit of cash. But now you essentially have to rent something that you used to own, and you can't borrow against it and so forth. So sale leasebacks is one. They extracted transaction and management fees, which are these fees that, you have to pay essentially for the privilege of being owned by the private equity firm. And I think even in this case, they did what's called a dividend recapitalization, where they essentially required the company to borrow money in order to pay a dividend to the private equity firm and the other investors. So there are all these tactics that, work for the private equity firm. It's a way to get money to the private equity firm, but don't necessarily work for the company. And at the risk of going on a little long, you mentioned, how do these companies make money how do these firms make money even when the companies fail? It really goes down to the bankruptcy process. So often what will happen is you'll have a private equity firm push a company into bankruptcy, and it owns the company, but it's also the company's largest lender. And what they do with that is, by being the owner and the lender, they're able to sell the company from itself to itself, and in the process push off the pension obligations and other debts that they have to employees and retirees onto these quasi-government agencies. And so it's a world where literally companies that they own can go bankrupt, and yet the private equity firm can succeed.
Wow. And so you're basically dumping the debt. I think in Wall Street they did that. Didn't they try and go after the airline pension fund and dump that or pilfer it? But this is interesting because, like I said, with the network example, people are just sitting around going, hey, why do I have to care about this? Yet this is going to impact your jobs. It's going to impact your pensions. It can impact other things. And it's interesting to me, all the different variations they have for this. You mentioned the dividend recapitalization. Are pension funds... One thing I was watching in an interview with you and the details in the book was, I'm very familiar with Silicon Valley and funds, startup funds, venture capitalists, and how they work. And a lot of it is, they're, even if they buy some turd startup software company that flops, we've seen a lot of those over the years, they're going to make their money off of fees. And so fees that they're charging or whatever they're charging into the company, and then fees that they're charging for their investors. And so that buffers, and of course spinning out or doing new rounds on their stuff. And it almost seems like private equities are kind of basically like venture capital, Silicon Valley startup funds, only they buy old companies as opposed to new. Is that a good analogy, or am I just smoking the...
No, I think that's a good distinction. Venture capitals are, in some ways, they're sort of playing the lottery a lot of times. They want to find that unicorn that's going to explode, and so they place a lot of bets, whereas private equity firms tend to buy established companies and then oftentimes try to extract value from it. I think one of the big differences is that, venture capital, at least as I understand it, typically makes an investment, but then is sort of along for the ride. They may get some board appointment rights, but they're not really in charge. Private equity firms, really are running the business. But the odd thing about it is, despite the fact that they run the business, they aren't necessarily going to be held legally responsible for their actions. So, one of the stories that I always go to is when Carlyle bought up the nursing home chain HCR Manor Care. They executed a lot of the tactics that we were just talking about in terms of sale leasebacks and transaction and management fees. Health code violations spike, staffing declines, and at least one resident dies. But when the resident's family sues for wrongful death because she went to the bathroom by herself and there wasn't the nursing staff to take care of her, Carlyle was able to get the case against it dismissed by essentially saying, we don't technically own the nursing home chain. We just advise a series of funds whose limited partners through several shell companies own the nursing home chain. And that was enough to get the case dismissed. And so to go back to your original question, one of the things that sort of unites venture capital and private equity is that neither is really going to be held responsible for what their companies do. And that misalignment of incentives can really hurt people.
Definitely. I mean, and it's kind of, I don't know. I don't know if I should say anti-American, anti-capitalism, but, that's kind of one of the things we have in America. If you injure people, you're held liable. I mean, you're an attorney. I mean, that's your job. No, I'm just kidding. But you have a whole chapter in your book about this. I have a sister who is in she's in a care center. She has MS. She has dementia. And one thing we've seen is she's been in about 5 or 6 throughout her life. And one thing we've seen over the years is these, they've gone from private guys that started them, like I start one or something like that, to where they've been bought out by, all these chains. And I don't know if there's a venture capital firm behind them, but we see the squeezing of care, which you see in most leveraged buyouts, where they try to thin out resources, they thin out services, they thin out employees, and they're trying to maximize the return on investment for their LBO. And I've seen the sufferers that she's done, and the care has been lowered in there. And you have a good chapter on your book on this as well.
Yeah, it's really tough because private equity has been extremely active in nursing home chains. Oftentimes there's, cuts to staffing and so forth. One estimate suggests that private equity ownership of nursing home chains is responsible for an estimated 20,000 premature deaths over a 15-year period.
Wow.
But it goes back to, I think, something that you were saying at the outset of the question, which is, This isn't necessarily an extreme form of capitalism. It's more like a perversion of it. You can be a Reagan Republican and, be concerned about private equity, because it's not people just trying to maximize value. It's people trying to maximize value, and then not necessarily being held responsible for the consequences of their actions. And, just looking at nursing homes specifically, I talked with lawyers that, represent families of folks that die in nursing homes. And, we've been looking at the research on this. And one of the things that PE owners will often do is essentially divide up the assets of the nursing home company among many different shell companies.
Wow.
So there'll be one company for the nursing home property, another for its operations, another for its pharmacy, and so forth. And by sort of complicating their ownership structures, it makes it very hard for families to recover when someone, gets a bed sore or is injured or dies. And it means that the private equity firm can hold on to the money, even if they're not necessarily, strictly entitled to it.
Wow, that is crazy. And this is how a lot of things work when it comes to trusts and shell companies and separating assets. We went through that with our attorneys back in the day with our courier company. You separate the cars and you make the thing. Hi, folks. Here's Voss here with a little station break. Hope you're enjoying the show so far. We'll resume here in a second. I'd like to invite you to come to my coaching, speaking, and training courses website. You can also see our new podcast over there at chrisvossleadershipinstitute.com. Over there, you can find all the different stuff that we do for speaking engagements if you'd like to hire me, training courses that we offer, and coaching for leadership, management, entrepreneurism, podcasting, corporate stuff. With over 35 years of experience in business and running companies as CEO. And be sure to check out chrisvossleadershipinstitute.com. Now back to the show. But it's interesting to me that these are very large companies, and they're being backed by what sort of firms are backing these? I mean, who gives these people money?
Yeah, so the largest private equity firms are backed typically by pension funds, by sovereign wealth funds, so funds of other countries, sometimes high net worth individuals. And I think the scale of private equity is often, folks don't really know it. PE firms spent an estimated $1 trillion buying companies last year. So,
wow.
For comparison, the entire US GDP is about $25 trillion.
Yeah.
If you looked at, I might miss up the exact order, but I believe it's KKR, Carlyle, and Blackstone. If you considered them together with their portfolio companies, would be the third, fourth, and fifth largest employers in the country after Walmart and Amazon.
Wow.
So there are these sprawling, enormous institutions, but because they don't sort of plaster their name on the companies that they own, oftentimes you have no idea that you're interacting with a private equity firm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had David Rubenstein on the show. We'll give a plug out so people can go watch that. His book, How to Invest. That was a lot of fun. I don't think he knew what to do with me. He's like, this guy is funny and interesting and crazy, and he was like, whatever. But we had a lot of fun on the show. What's curious about me is, and I'm sure people are asking or assumed, like I did, how come this doesn't fall under the Department of Justice enforcing monopoly rules, antitrust rules?
So it does. The private equity acquisitions are often part of what are called roll-ups. So not just buying a single company, but buying up many companies in a single industry. So, you buy up all of the portable toilets in the region, or you buy up all of the church nonprofit software, or all of the OBGYN clinics in a certain region. And potentially, by doing that, you're able to, in the positive sense, have, efficiencies of scale, but in the negative sense, you have market power that allows you to, raise prices, lower quality care, potentially lower wages, and so forth. I will say that there's been a lot of public speeches lately about, using by Department of Justice officials about using the antitrust laws to sort of look critically at a lot of these acquisitions. I mean, one of the challenges, just speaking honestly, is that it's hard for any one institution to take on sort of the whole scope of these antitrust issues. in that, to go back to, $1 trillion worth of acquisitions, that's a not insubstantial part of the economy. So while antitrust plays a role here, I think that there are sort of other areas of the law and other sort of institutional actors that can also be useful here.
And maybe we need to update the antitrust laws. I mean, they were created, in the early 1900s?
Yeah, and there have been efforts in Congress to update the antitrust laws in the last session. To get a little in the weeds here, there's also something called the merger guidelines, which is an interpretive document that the government puts out, and that's currently being revised.
There you go. Capitalism is great. It's good to have, but there is such a thing, I believe, and more I've been convinced of it, is unbridled capitalism. And that was the whole reason we put in antitrust laws. There needs to be some constraints and guardrails on capitalism. It can't just be unfettered where, we can just go do whatever we want. I mean, that's the reason there's rules against product liability and stuff like that. But you mentioned one thing, and I guess one of the big challenges is, of course, we live in kind of almost an oligarchy where, with SCOTUS's Citizens United rulings and other things, you can just buy whatever politicians you want. There's a lot of money of this awash in politicians and, of course, people that run the rail between politics and working for these organizations. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think private equity firms have been almost uniquely successful in advancing their agenda in government. Private equity and investment firms, according to Open Secrets, have spent an estimated $900 million on the campaigns of federal candidates since 1990. They have employed really kind of the biggest names in government. We're talking multiple secretaries of Treasury, State, Defense, a vice president, 2 former speakers of the House, any number of generals, a CIA director, senators and Congress people. And that sort of bench has been really useful in advancing its agenda in Congress. Very briefly, one area where I think they have been really passionate has been around the carried interest loophole. Some of your listeners may be familiar with this idea that, hedge fund and private equity managers often pay a lower effective tax rate than certainly I, as a government employee, do. The thing about it is, despite repeated efforts by presidents, both Democratic and Republican, to try to rein in the carried interest loophole, they have all uniformly failed, to such an extent that last time President Biden tried to propose closing the loophole, not only did that effort fail, but private equity gained a new tax advantage through the course of that debate. So it's an area where I think private equity firms have been really, really successful.
There you go. Now, one thing I've been interested in, and the other reason I wanted your book written was I owned a mortgage company for 20 years, and I watched the crash of 2008. I was consulting with banks at the time, and I remember we started getting what were called jingle mail. And I remember being in an office in San Diego going, "What's jingle mail?" And they go, "So many people have thrown their keys into the mail and said, F you, go ahead and foreclose on the home, that we get U.S. mail bags that when you jingle them, they're all the keys." And I was like, that's extraordinary. And I wondered at the time if we were entering an age where, everything we'd done had kind of moved from assets and money, and middle class had moved from investments in different stuff to where their kids were just buying rims, basically, or blowing it at I don't know, whatever they blow it on, expensive cars and different things. And so I'm like, are we going to end up in a position where we're going to become a renter society? And one of the big concerns, and I think this concerns everybody who's listening, is one of the great wealth generators for the middle class has been able to buy a home and have it advance in equity and be able to live well with that. I mean, the boomers, that was the real big key for them. You have a chapter in your book where you talk about that. And what's been extraordinary is the last few years, we've seen these private equity firms go in and they're just track buying huge amounts of homes, driving up the prices where most people can't afford them. And almost what seems to be like what I predicted earlier, that we might turn into a renter society, only this time it wouldn't be by our choice.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I should say this answer, like all of them, I'm speaking personally and not necessarily on behalf of my employer. But when we're talking about ownership, home ownership, private equity has really played a transformative role here. When you had the Great Recession and you had an enormous, sort of amount of foreclosures and people with underwater mortgages, rather than sort of having a temporary reprieve on paying principals or principal reduction or anything like that, the FHFA and Fannie and Freddie ultimately, collected these foreclosed homes, and rather than selling them individually so that people could buy them, started selling them in these large tracts where only institutional investors could, especially private equity firms. And when they did that, private equity got in the game, and rather than then reselling these homes, they converted them into rental properties. And so you have large tracts. If you worked in the mortgage industry, you're familiar with this. Communities that really were devastated by the Great Recession, whether you're talking about, Las Vegas or Tampa, Atlanta and so forth. You have many of the same people living in the same neighborhood, but now they are renters rather than owners, which, takes away the opportunity for building wealth. It's gotten to such a point that home ownership, as I recall, is now back to what it was in the 1980s for people in, for African Americans, at least according to one commentator, home ownership is back down to what it was during the civil rights era. So it's a really transformative trend in sort of the nature of building wealth in America, and private equity helped to lead the way.
That is amazing. And I, one of the companies, I don't know if you're familiar with SFR Investments in Las Vegas. You mentioned Las Vegas, but when I first moved back from California, I rented a home from them because I was moving back, and they had run an extraordinary game where they, with the laws of first and second titling in Nevada, they all the banks had pretty much not been paying the HOA fees, and so they went in and cut a deal with the HOAs and bought tract homes for pennies on the dollar just by paying the bankruptcy or the HOA fee backlog. And they acquired, I think it was 800 or 1,600 homes. And then because of a stipulation in the law, they were able to write off the first and second liens and have them taken off the title, or fight to have them taken off the title. And the banks were like, wait, what the hell just happened? We have first right of title. And it's like, no, the way Nevada law is written, HOA does. And so they fought that for years, but they acquired a ton of homes. And the HOAs were like, there's the key, you paid our fee. And the bank's like, what the hell? And then, of course, my neighbors were angry because they're like, man, it's, you're a nice guy, Chris, but, there's all this riffraff now in the neighborhood. Maybe I was the riffraff. But it's extraordinary. And so now people can't build wealth. The prices are so high, we need a reset. I think we would. And the resets are never good. But, that affects how families can build wealth. We talk about how, the new Gen Z is trying to make it in this whole post-COVID world. And, maybe we just end up with an enslaved renter society, along with college debt and all the other different things that we have going on, healthcare debt, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, you don't need to be sort of a democratic socialist to be concerned about this. You can be a traditional conservative and be worried about this. Home ownership is down dramatically, especially for younger people. And you look at the surveys, and it's not that preferences for home ownership have changed. People still want to be able to own a home, but they say that they can't afford it. It's interesting because, when you look at what it's like to live in these rental properties that private equity firms own, it's a pretty tough road for a lot of folks, not just about, whether or not they're maintaining properties as they should, or if a renter falls behind, sort of exacting, frankly, kind of embarrassing or cruel tactics. I was reading about, how one private equity owned owner would, wrap caution police tape around a home if a person was a few days late on their rent and so forth.
Really?
But also, that a lot of the money comes not just from the core rent, but from piling on fees that, as you can start adding an awful lot of fees before somebody is going to move, whether it's fees, for things that you might expect, like a pool or something like that, but, special lock fees and things like that people just aren't going to be aware of. when they first signed their lease agreement. So I think it is really changing the nature of what it means to build wealth in the country.
Yeah, and changing our ability to build wealth. Ever since 1980s, when I grew up, it just seems like Main Street's been attacked. You can blame the liberalism and Reaganism. I'm still waiting for my checks for that trickle down work. I don't know about you. Maybe you got your check, but there's a point where it's out of control, and I think housing is the biggest concern because people are just trapped. I mean, they're trapped, and we're almost. I think you mentioned in another interview I saw you talking about just a rent extraction market. And since there's such a monopoly of tracts they bought, you don't have really a choice. It's almost a monopoly.
Yeah, I think like the most extreme version of this in housing is mobile homes, where private equity firms have been buying mobile home parks. And I don't know, if this was ever part of your business, but the mobile homes are very rarely mobile. They're usually sealed with concrete on the property, and so
only in tornadoes.
Yes, exactly. Homeowners really pay two rents. One is the mortgage that they pay on the property, and then they pay what's called a lot rent. And so they're really tough stories about private equity firms buying up mobile home parks and then increasing the lot rent. In some cases, I think allegedly even doubling the lot rent. And this had a twofold effect because it meant that the residents had to pay, obviously, increased lot rents, but it also meant that the homes that they were had paid a mortgage on or owned outright now dramatically lost value because fewer people could buy them. And so it was a way to extract not just the income from residents, but also potentially their wealth.
And those things are expensive to move. So you almost have a gun at your head where you go, I had that with my storage units. Like they love to give me a low cut in. And then over the course of a couple of years, I just got another one that I'm just like, seriously? And I sit there and go, okay, I got to pay movers $1,000 to move this crap. And they just did this. And how much am I paying per month? And, and then they know that game is going on. In fact, I can name a few companies that do that. And some of the big, what do I want to call them here? The rental companies and some of these big funds, some of them, they're really awful landlords. Jared Kushner, excuse me. I don't know what that was. But you read about some of the things that were going on in some of their stuff, and you're just like, holy crap. So what are some things that people can do? What are some things that the government should maybe look at doing? What are things maybe we should demand more from our politicians to change or improve the business? Because evidently, I imagine there's some good things that private equities do.
Yeah, I always say that, as long as people want to build factories and hire employees, there is a role for finance and investment to play. You need somebody that's willing to put up the money and take the risk for a business to succeed. So my goal is not to end private equity or anything like that. It's to make private equity, I always say, sort of less interesting in some sense. The basic problems that we've got with private equity is they tend to invest for the short term. They tend to load up companies with a lot of debt and a lot of fees, and they tend to be, as we've been talking about, insulated from liability for their actions. And if you change that, private equity can be made a useful force overwhelmingly for society. So how do you get there? You can, push change through Congress, although Congress is, it's often very hard to get action on these issues. There's things that can happen at the local and state level, and I actually think that's where a lot of the movement on this is going to be over the next few years. For instance, requiring that if a company is bought in your state, that they not execute some of the tactics that we've been talking about dividend recapitalizations and sale leasebacks and so forth. Federal regulators, whether we're talking about the SEC, the Treasury, Federal Reserve, Fannie and Freddie, when we're talking about housing, can do a lot of these things. So I think that there are a lot of different levers that people can pull in order to make private equity work for the country.
There you go. And of course, your book is the greatest thing that we could have to expose some of this stuff, talk about it, get people educated, get people learn about it and go, hey, what the hell's going on? And that's the real important part. That's why we do the show. Education is everything. The more you know, as it were. Any final thoughts you want to share, Brendan, before we go?
Just very briefly, as people are learning more about this issue, don't underestimate your own influence. I think that, I say this as a lowly government employee, the hearing people talk about these issues can empower folks in government, can make people realize, how issues affect, people in the real world. So I encourage people to learn more and to make their voice heard.
There you go. Make your voice heard. Talk about it more. And I mean, capitalism is a great thing. The weird thing about America is everyone thinks they're going to get rich. It's like that Fight Club scene. Everyone thinks they're going to be a millionaire and rock stars. And so everyone's like, well, maybe we shouldn't regulate rich people because I'm going to be rich someday, according to the American dream. And so we kind of have this thing where we're like, hey, I don't want any rules. So when I get there, I can do whatever, Elon Musk is doing, whatever that is this week. I'm not sure he knows either. No, I'm just kidding. We're just kidding, Elon. Don't sue us. So there you go. So fun is fun. Give us a .com wherever you want people, Brendan, to find you on the interwebs.
Plunderthebook.com and Brendan, twitter.com/Brendan Ballou. And you can look up the book anywhere books are sold.
There you go, guys. Educate yourself on what's going on because this affects everyone's bottom line. Your future, your pension plans, your retirement, money you're making. Main Street seems to be the one thing that needs to recover in all of this. Thank you very much, Brendan, for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the time.
There you go. Thanks so much for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, youtube.com/Chris Voss, linkedin.com/Chris Voss, and help us out on TikTok. Give us a like over there. We're trying to be cool. It's not working, of course. Thanks for tuning in. Be good to each other. Stay safe. We'll see you guys next time.